What I will say, if you have plans to see any other new musical opening in the West End this month, then I would abandon them all, because this is the only one people are going to be talking about. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Jo. I'm a professional theatre critic here on social media, and this evening I was invited to go and review Why Am I So Single?, the brand new musical which has just opened at the Garrick Theatre in the West End. This is the hugely anticipated second musical from the Tony Award-winning writers of Six, Toby Marlow and Lucy Moss. And it's been hugely anticipated both by the worldwide theatre community and by myself, because I got to go and see the public workshop presentation of this same show last year. And I said as much at the time, but I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was a hugely exciting step forward for their careers. I'm going to tell you more about why in today's review, because much of the same brilliance of those songs and those characters and that story and that material is still evident in this West End production of Why Am I So Single? And yet, there is something that's not quite all the way there with it. And by talking about the performances, the writing, the creative choices, we're going to try and work out what that is. Now, if you enjoyed this review, I have created many more for social media, which you can find both on my theatre-themed YouTube channel, on podcast platforms, as well as on other social media platforms. You can find shorter reviews of mine on Instagram and TikTok, all at MickeyJoTheatre. You can also see me in person or via live stream later this month at the Phoenix Arts Club in London, where I will be talking all things theatre, critical discourse, and will also be joined by some very exciting performer guests. But before all of that, we have a show to review. So let's talk about Why Am I So Single? As always, if you have seen this show already, comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings. I would love to know what you all think. In the meantime, did I love it just as much as the workshop? Was I disappointed? Let's find out. So I would like to begin by telling you a little bit about the narrative of the show and the circumstances under which it was created. And the context you need to understand here is that Toby Marlow and Lucy Moss gained huge success as the composers, co-writers of the musical Six, which went from this student production for Oxford University to this Edinburgh Fringe show, to this professionalised Edinburgh Fringe show, to a West End success, to a global sensation, turning them into Tony Award-winning composers whose future work was hotly anticipated, like I said. All of which sets them up with something of a challenge. In music, you would call it their difficult second album. In musical theatre, their difficult second show. Because as brilliant and financially rewarding as a huge success on your first try is, it does beget the question, what else can they do? And with the nature of Six being slightly more of a concert, being a shorter show, and not being, that dramatically sophisticated, even though I think it's a brilliant piece of theatre, as well as a deceptively intelligent one, all eyes are on this show to see what it tells you about them as writers. What else can they do? What more can they do? Is this going to be just as successful? Does everything they touch turn to gold? Was Six a fluke? These are the questions that people will ask. And it's under these stressful conditions that Toby and Lucy created a show that feels semi-autobiographical, because it is about two musical theatre writers who are meant to be working on a big fancy new musical but are procrastinating from their writing due to challenges in their respective romantic lives. In other words, rather than just get on and write their big fancy musical and decide what it's going to be about and start actually putting the thing together and meet deadlines, they are too busy asking each other the question, why am I so single? Which is where this show comes from. And it's semi-autobiographical in a tongue-in-cheek way. The characters, rather than being called Toby and Lucy, are instead named after characters from their favourite musical and are called, see if you can guess this one, Oliver and Nancy. And so as they try and write the show that we are watching in this very meta-theatrical way, they spend an evening together in Oliver's flat where they commiserate about, recent dating failures, as well as reflecting on their own emotional boundaries and insecurities and challenging each other. And we go to flashbacks from the weeks before. We go to dream sequence musical numbers. We go further into the past, but always returning to the lounge of Oliver's flat where we are nearing some kind of an emotional breakthrough for these characters. Needless to say, there will be spoilers about the narrative in today's review. If you don't want to know anything else about this plot, stop watching this review, go and buy a ticket, come back to me when you have seen the thing. Now, if this is all sounding inherently a little bit navel-gazy, by which I mean a little bit self-indulgent, you know, they're just writing about themselves and their own lives and expecting this to be fascinating to an audience, it is, but the same comment can be made about a great many different theatrical works, and I don't think that's inherently a problem, because the themes which it evokes do end up being universal. Ultimately, this becomes a story about the meaning and the importance of platonic friendship that doesn't center anything in its conclusion other than platonic friendship, with the idea that this is enough. The characters don't need romantic reward alongside that. In terms of this material and these songs and this book and what this tells us about Marlow and Moss as composers, looking at this and Six alongside each other, it's now very easy to discern what their voice is, what their sense of humour is, what their sound is when it comes to songwriting, and they are first and foremost exceptionally talented songwriters, especially within the pop musical theatre realm. Six plays more with the idea of familiarity of specific pop artists and specific pop songs, whereas with this, it feels urgent and contemporary, but it's still theatricalized. And this is what I really love about their writing, and what makes them some of the most exciting musical theatre composers that we have right now, is they theatricalize contemporary music in the same way that in hindsight we can see many composers having done previously. And this is also a post-Hamilton conversation for bringing new genres into musical theatre, or at the very least popularizing a greater number of music genres within musical theatre. But even looking at the dawn of jazz and the dawn of rock and roll, it feels like Marlow and Moss are part of this new era to bring this really contemporary pop sound into musicals. And in many ways, this show does feel like the future of musical theatre. It has a couple of roadblocks, however, in its way, which I'm going to talk about in this review. Tonally and in terms of the plot, I've thought since the workshop that this feels somewhere between Six, simply because of their voice, and also because of some of its theatrical structure, which I'll talk more about, and A Strange Loop, I guess because of the meta-theatrical nature of that. But I was recently having dinner with someone else who saw the show, who remarked on its similarities to Sondheim's Company. There you had a show produced in 1970, quintessentially of its time, reflecting on the nature of relationships then. This one is doing the same thing for a completely different generation in 2024, and that's very interesting as a comparison. The question that arises from that is, does this speak too specifically to that younger generation? Well, I have heard now that people from different generations, people from older generations, have really enjoyed this show. I don't think I'm even really Gen Z enough or part of this TikTok generation to speak to that specifically. The one thing that seems to be dividing people is a song about a bee being in the flat and the way that they react to a bee in the flat. People are just baffled by this. And, you know, I think, is it generation specific to react to a bee being in the flat while you're spending the evening, like, drinking Prosecco out of the fridge, watching Netflix, and suddenly a bee in the flat is like the most dramatic, operatic, proportioned thing? Is that generation specific? Is that just something from us as younger people? Because I completely implicitly understood the drama of that moment and the comedy of the way that they reacted to it. Interestingly enough, that is also the Act 1 finale, and it's kind of necessary to have something of that kind of scale because there's not a lot of other reasons to justify the end of the first act. This is a show that struggles to justify having two acts in the first place, because we are staying in the same location, we are covering the same themes, the whole thing just develops. And that's not to say there aren't plenty of plays that are also set in one place, and I don't think the scope needs to be any bigger than it is. The story that they're telling is a valid one. I don't want that story to feel any bigger or any smaller. It just feels as though we need that little bit of induced drama to send us away to go and buy ice creams. What I also like about the Bee song, and I'm jumping around a little bit here, is that it utilizes the themes from the songs of the first act. It plays with various different songs that have come before and offers little mini reprises of them in a very One Day More West Side Story quintet-esque way, and that's one of many ways that this show sort of references classic musicals, which is an aspect of its personality I haven't mentioned until now, but I alluded to when I saw the workshop, because it's something that they've been keeping quite secret. Again, I'm going to give you spoilers here, but everyone in this show who is named is named after an Oliver or Oliver adjacent character. They have one shared friend whose name is Artie, who has a surname of like Full Dodger or something. They have a musical agent called Faye, full name Faye Ginn. An unnamed character that our protagonist Oliver met on Bumble is referred to as Mr. Bumble. It's very clever. And those are not the only musical theatre references in the piece. We have some obvious nods to shows like Les Mis, and I enjoy that about Why Am I So Single. Doubling back a little, the reason I think it speaks to audiences beyond Gen Z, even though, you know, in terms of the dialogue, in terms of the personalities of these characters, it feels very much for that generation, which I think is no bad thing, is because of the universality of the themes, because it becomes about friendship and seeing these two characters connect and seeing them become more vulnerable with each other and come to the conclusion that, you know, of course they're worthy of love, of course they're capable of being loved, look at how much they love each other. One thing that becomes apparent as we are getting to know these characters, we can tell, and they play with the idea that they are perhaps loosely inspired by Toby and Lucy writing the show. And, you know, as they're putting this together, you have to imagine they know each other implicitly. They have an extraordinary amount of history in this friendship. The audience does not know them personally. And the way that they try and introduce these characters to the audience is with, you know, character articulated through dialogue and through these early musical numbers, through the title song, Why Am I So Single, which is one of the first pieces of music that we hear, but also through a lot of history dumping. There are many valuable interactions that contextualize their friendship, which we would ordinarily say you just had to be there to get it. Instead, they show us those flashbacks. There's one in particular towards the start of the second act where we see a sequence of the first night that they met each other, when they were, you know, flirting with or being pursued by different people in a club setting, and they ended up having an unexpected kiss on the dance floor. We see this played out twice, a little like Satisfied from Hamilton, where we see it from their sort of rose-tinted perspective, and then we see the uncomfortable, drunken, embarrassing reality of what actually happened. This is one of the few sequences in the show that has merit and, you know, maybe truthful to their own experience of their friendship together, but could probably be cut from the show. There are two more songs I feel that we could cut just to get the thing a little bit shorter, and I'll talk more about why that might be valuable later on. But one of them is in the first act. Joe Foster's character, Oliver, does this Marilyn Monroe style number about the way that they are treated by men. That could be covered in a few lines of dialogue, and it kind of steps on a more impressive number that comes a little bit later called Disco Ball, which we'll talk about. The other I think we could do without is right at the end of the show. It's an admittedly very moving song about grief that Lisa Tully's character Nancy sings. Again, I think it could be covered in a few lines of dialogue, because at that point the ending of the thing has become very protracted. This is one of the problems that the show has. It doesn't quite make the emotional impact that it ought to. There is one nice twist in the ending, but we take too long to get there, and we spend too long dwelling on it afterwards. There are about 4 or 5 songs in a row, all of which contribute to the overall ending of the piece. It's like they never quite land the plane successfully because they go around so many times before touching down. We're just desperate to get off the thing. And it's potentially for that reason that it doesn't instantly trigger this emotional response. You know, it doesn't quite pull at the heartstrings, even though it's attempting to in several different ways. It's really covering that ground and explaining why it ought to be emotional and the meaning and the impact of it all. It feels more like an early career bell ringer just tugging at so many different things, hoping one of those is heartstrings. Let me return, however, to some of my favourite musical moments in this show. There is a song called See You Never, which is choreographed with brilliant contemporary tap, and it's such a fun song. It's a really great number. It's just blissful and uplifting, and it communicates joy through that dance, but there's a deeper meaning to it as well, because the sound of those taps, and what they have is taps on the bottom of trainers and Converses, so it is very contemporary, which is thrilling in and of itself. I love tap, and I thought that was great, but the taps are used in the earlier parts of the song to indicate the system sounds of a mobile phone while like typing out a message or pressing backspace and trying to think of what to send to a prospective romantic partner when you're like over analyzing it and not wanting to like send a reply too soon. And that's what the taps are used to suggest. Genius. Absolutely genius, and exactly what I would expect from Marlow and Moss. It combines their love of classic musical theatre and this really contemporary sensibility and identity. The show's two strongest songs are also what I think we will come to recognise in future decades as classic Marlow and Moss, and they each do what other songs in Six do. They feel like they have counterparts, because we have a big emotional ballad called Just In Case that I, after I saw the workshop, was convinced was called I Would Abandon It All, because that's the big refrain that we hear belted over and over. It is a great number. You are going to hear it in musical theatre showcases and audition rooms. It's an absolute belter, and it feels very similar to Heart of Stone. It feels like this show's Heart of Stone, and for that reason, perhaps, it comes roughly in the same place in the show structurally, and I feel like it ought to come a little bit later, because in a two-act structure with an interval, the penultimate song of the first act isn't really a powerful position, and this is one of the most powerful moments musically of the show. The other is a song called Disco Ball. This comes after Nancy challenges Oliver to lower their defences, stop using comedy as a barrier and be honest and vulnerable, and Oliver has been trying to articulate this entire time why their positions on dating and romance and perhaps their prospects aren't necessarily comparable, because Oliver has to contend with, if not more issues, then different issues as a queer person, as someone with a non-cisgender gender identity. And so Oliver performs a song called Disco Ball, which echoes the same facade with which they have been repressing their feelings, and they become this glittery disco performer in the middle of a big dance sequence. The ensemble come in all of these costumes. We have all the lights going, and it's this high adrenaline, high energy song. Functionally, it's exactly the same as All You Want to Do from Six, that begins as this fun, sexy Britney number, and as it goes on for about 6 minutes, you slowly come to realize that there is a dark undercurrent to the whole thing and a deeper meaning. That's exactly what happens with Disco Ball. And in both those numbers, we see the performer giving more and more of themselves, and the vulnerability bursts open through this facade of a different kind of a pretense. Disco Ball, for that reason, probably my favourite number in the show, and I love the way that they use musical numbers functionally. It's what makes them great musical theatre writers, and not just great songwriters. I would love for them to find a couple of new tricks alongside these ones, alongside being able to write a really great ballad and a really, eventually dark, high-energy number like that. The other moment we see a real similarity to Six comes in the second act, when they start talking aloud about how they have devised the real meaning of the show right there in front of us, how going through the motions of this and having these conversations and talking about their love lives has helped them figure out what the show is. And Six does more or less the same thing when they sort of discover in front of us, like, oh, if only we'd realised comparing ourselves was a horrible idea. Oh, we could have done that as a song. There's a very similar crystallization moment in Why Am I So Single, and it's not that I don't enjoy that, but I do look forward to the shows where they don't feel as though they need to labour the point to such an extent, and they just trust the material to convey that on its own terms. It's not out of place here whatsoever, because the material is so meta-theatrical. I just worry that that's going to become a crutch. In terms of the rest of the material, there are a couple of moments of dialogue that circulate around the same points a little too much. The whole thing could be condensed, it could be edited, and I wonder if the extent to which Six was honed and edited is because these were early career composers being commissioned for their first professional show, and they have a lot of pressure to get it right, and there's a nervousness that comes with that. Even after Six was a hit in the West End, they still tweaked it for Broadway and then incorporated those Broadway changes into the UK version, subsequently all the global versions, I guess. And with this, I wonder if they were a little more, not knowing them personally, but emboldened by their own success, and it feels a little less edited for that reason. We've seen a similar thing happen in the show's production, which is what I want to talk to you about next, along with the creative choices. So fundamentally, it does feel a little bit overproduced, and what happened with Six is that it grew from this smaller thing. It went from the Edinburgh Fringe, it did a little bit of a UK tour, it went to the Arts Theatre, which is this tiny theatre in the West End. If it were in New York, it would absolutely be considered off-Broadway. Even when Six was upscaling from the Arts Theatre to the Lyric Theatre, there were naysayers saying, oh, it's never going to be able to sell that space, it only works in this tiny theatre. We now know that not to be true. Six has played all sorts of theatres around the world, and cruise ships and massive regional touring houses, and it's now settled at its forever home at the Vaudeville Theatre in the West End, which is much bigger than the Arts was. But like another recent West End success, Operation Mincemeat, it grew to that point naturally and gradually. Why Am I So Single, however, perhaps on the back of the success of Six, has gone straight into the West End, which feels a little bit inadvisable, especially when the show is wholly original. It's not based on existing intellectual property, it's not based on a known film, which is something we're seeing West End audiences hugely responsive to at the moment. It also doesn't feature huge name recognition stars. Don't get me wrong, we're going to talk about the cast, they're very talented, but they are newly discovered rising stars. They don't each necessarily have huge built-in musical theatre fan bases, and certainly don't have mainstream name recognition like film or TV stars. And even this might be okay if the production had cheaper running costs, but it has a surprisingly large ensemble, all of which makes the whole thing very difficult. And it is surprising that they didn't make the choice to take this to somewhere like the Edinburgh Festival Fringe first, where I think there would have been considerable reward, and this is probably the thing I feel the most strongly about in this entire review. I think there would have been huge reward from condensing it, even if there was the plan to subsequently put material back in. I think they would have learned a lot about what this show needs, and also what this show is. I think they would have discovered its identity if they had shrunk it down to a 75-minute version, a 90-minute version even. I think that would have taught them a lot. That would have been formative for the show's development. It also would have, from a production standpoint, it would have given them word of mouth, it would have given them buzz and excitement. London audiences would have seen this happening on socials and been like, oh, I want to see that, but it's up in Edinburgh, so by the time it arrives, people are already excited about it. It's hard to build momentum when you're already open in the West End and you needed to sell tickets yesterday. What I said there about the show's identity, I feel as though it doesn't quite know exactly what it wants to be, and Six had figured that out by the time it was able to become hugely successful. Six knew exactly what its perspective was, and it was so commercially viable. Six is one of the most commercial shows, and its title helps, and what it's written about helps, and that gives people an easy way to understand what it is. I always think the commercial viability of a show when it comes to word of mouth boils down to, can you explain it to someone in one short sentence? And Six is a pop concert featuring the wives of Henry VIII. It's easy, it's instant. Why Am I So Single? I know this show quite well at this point, and I would struggle to explain it in 2 sentences, 3 sentences. I cannot give it to you in one. It's this meta musical from, do you know the writers of Six? Well, it's kind of about the process of them writing their next show, but also it features, it's hard to explain. That doesn't mean it doesn't have artistic value. It just means it's harder to market. And unfortunately, I love the artwork for this show, and I love a lot of the ethos behind it, and not to discredit the work of any one individual, but I don't think the marketing for this show has been particularly successful, because the focus on all of these different character portraits, not many of whom we get to really know over the course of the show, by the way, and this title, Why Am I So Single, combined together make it look like a cheap ITV dating show, I'm sorry to say. And it's much smarter than that, it's much more sophisticated than that. Now, when I say overproduced, what I actually mean by that is the scale that it's grown to doesn't necessarily fit, like I was saying, this show's identity. When I first saw it, it was in an empty rehearsal space, and that worked for it to a certain extent, because it's about these writers devising a show that they are creating around them. And physically, all we're really seeing is that they are sitting together on a sofa, and all of the furniture in the flat, in that space around them, was played by members of the ensemble who were rolling in to be a footstool, or holding things to be a coat rack. The show still retains that as part of Ellen Kane's exceptional choreography, which I'll talk more about, but it's odd now because we have an actual set. So someone is portraying the plant next to a plant. Someone's portraying the coat rack and the fridge where there are no coat rack or fridge. So those are funny moments. Someone is portraying the lamp next to an actual lamp. So it's odd for them to duplicate the furniture that's already there, and it feels like they're less necessary. And we now ask ourselves the question, why are they playing furniture on stage? And you can foist meaning onto that in terms of their loneliness and what the furniture represents and like the world come to life around them, and just the fact that what we're seeing isn't strictly reality. But it was definitely funnier. It definitely got a lot more laughs at Sadler's Wells, where they were creating the only furniture that we were seeing because they had to, because the space was blank. I will say the furniture costumes and all of the costume design by Max Johns is award-worthy. It's brilliant, it's creative, it's silly, it's wonderful. Loved the costume design. Also really enjoyed the set design. This was by Moy Tran, and there were so many little hidden details and references to Friends. They talk a lot about Friends in the show, particularly the final episode and the moment shared between Ross and Rachel when she says, "I got off the plane." And they are subtle little details in the Why Am I So Single set that you will have to be looking for to see. But there is a picture frame hidden somewhere within the set that looks like the yellow, like embossed thing that used to be on the door of the Friends apartment. Also, the color of that door is the same color as Oliver's flat door, but we only see that when it spins around. They go to a restaurant at one point called Olive a Twist, which is a reference to Oliver, and those nods are very clever, and they make us question reality and whether what we're seeing is really real. Does this pierce the sincerity and the honesty of the story a little bit because it starts to feel manufactured? I don't know. But from that original threadbare rehearsal space production, we now have a much more bright, vibrant, full set with a lot of neon lighting, with colourful costumes, with set pieces, with doorways, with the band up there at the back, elevated with this pointillism pattern on the floors and the walls. And it looks great, it looks expensive, it looks produced. I just don't know if it befits the character of this material. Like I said, I don't know if that is conducive to what this show's identity actually is when you get down to the heart of the thing. And it does feel like, with all of this going on, what falls out of focus just a little bit is the humanity of the story and the charm of these characters. And that's a problem, because when you lose the charm of these characters, they then just start to feel the littlest bit self-involved and a little obnoxious, because they're talking about themselves and their problems at length, and there's no real subplot here beyond those conversations. So we need to really like them to be able to get on board with that. I ended up feeling as though it was just this little bit too bright, this little bit too brash, this little bit too obvious, and we did lose a little bit of the charm in that as well. On a technical level, that first number, Why Am I So Single, has a lot of important character building lyrics, but also a great many brilliant witty comedy lyrics, a lot of which we lost to the sound balance. And I think the orchestration at that point is just a little bit too full. I love the orchestrations as we develop, but I want the whole thing to grow and become increasingly theatrical, especially when we get to the likes of Disco Ball. That should reach heights that we haven't had before. When she's singing I Should Abandon It All, when she's singing Just In Case, that should reach emotional heights that we haven't had before, and that should be echoed in the orchestration. Why Am I So Single, I think, could sound, it doesn't sound as full as those, but it could sound even thinner, so we can really hear those comedy lyrics as well. The orchestrations, vocal arrangements, and musical supervision are all the work, by the way, of Joe Bayton. The opening framing sequence I really love. We see these members of the company wearing masks to look like these characters. We see them in front of this cardboard version of the Garrick Theatre facade. They make references to the Garrick throughout the thing, and this is a great way to commence the show. I wonder if we don't feel a little too disconnected from the reality that they are writing a musical, because by the time that they mention it again, it's almost as though we've forgotten. I feel like they need just one more reminder phone call from the agent. That also adds tension to the whole thing. They're working on a deadline. We need just at some point between the first time we hear from the agent and the moment in the second act where Nancy says that's what our musical is going to be about, we need some sort of a reminder that they're writing a musical, because even I was like, oh yeah, that's what they're doing here. Finishing with some of my favourite details from these creative choices, though, like I said, the choreography by Ellen Kane. It's brilliant. It is energetic. It is characterful, it is thrilling. That contemporary tap moment is fantastic. There's a song as part of the show's 25-minute ending sequence called Men Are Trash. It's brilliant the way that that is choreographed as well. And the direction also really strong and really understands the tone of the show that is in some ways a little bit at odds with the rest of it. But Lucy Moss, who of course is one of the show's co-writers, and Ellen Kane have co-directed, and the direction implicitly understands, obviously, Lucy and Toby's sense of humour, and that is, as well as their songwriting capabilities, the other really winning factor here. Because for everything I've said in criticism of the piece, the material is so strong, it is so funny, the songs are so good, and it's so close to being perfect. It's just, you know, I think it's just come here too fast, or in such a way that it hasn't necessarily found its finished product yet. Finally, let's talk about the performances. Largely, it is these two as our protagonists. This is Lisa Tully as Nancy, who is an alumnus of Six the Musical. This is Joe Foster as Oliver. They have appeared in many shows recently, including & Juliet, including the revival of Legally Blonde at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, also directed by Lucy Moss with choreography by Ellen Kane. There is a supporting performance from Noah Thomas as part of a brilliant ensemble cast who are dancers. And what we get from Joe and Lisa is this extraordinary energy and charisma as soon as they arrive, this brilliant sense of humour, but chiefly, the most important thing, their wonderful chemistry with each other, as well as with Noah Thomas. You utterly believe in this friendship trio, but particularly in the bond that Nancy and Oliver have found with each other. That really is vital to this show's success. And it's another one like Six, where I enjoy the opportunity that performers will have to bring a little something of themselves to their roles. They are using their own accents on stage, and the alternate performers in these roles have different accents. So if you go and see those performances, there will be a different accent, there will be a different characterization that goes along with that. I have long said that Joe Foster is a remarkable rising star, really at home with the comedy in this material. Joe gives us fantastic production numbers, and Disco Ball is this incredible, just the ultimate soul-bearing musical moment, but Joe is really at their best in delivering the comedic dialogue. Lisa Tully does a fantastic job with the comedic dialogue, but she is at her best when belting out these power ballads and giving us fantastic vocals. She's played all the Queens in Six, for crying out loud. So it's the songs where she shines the most brightly. Curiously, I do think there's the slightest imbalance in their characters, because I think we get to know Joe's character, Oliver, a little more fully. I think we get a little more of that character's personality, and beyond, you know, just being exhausted by breakups and like still being obsessed with her ex, it takes us a long time to get to know Nancy. And a part of that is by design, because she is kind of pushing Oliver into more vulnerable confessions and revelations and admissions, even though there's something that she hasn't quite come to terms with herself. And that is by design, because we then find that out subsequently, and it kind of rocks her world. But what that means is that we can't get to know her fully for a very long time. I also have a little bit of a qualm. This probably belongs in the creative section, but I think Joe Foster leaves the stage as Oliver while Nancy is singing the song Just in Case. And so it positions it to feel more like an internal monologue, where I feel like it ought to be something that Nancy is singing to Oliver. Perhaps they've made the choice at this point, because of actions that will happen later on, for her to not convey that to Oliver so that he is still surprised. But certainly I thought it had more weight in the workshop version, where I felt it was though it was something that she was saying to him. And when she feels like such a grounded character by comparison, you know, making more, like, slightly more sensible choices, that song, when I first heard it, came as a real surprise, because it's her admitting that she's like, I know this is a terrible thing, but like, if my ex called today, I would go. And that was a real shock. I also just don't know in the material if she has as much of a personality to discern, because it's really just the relationship stuff that we see her going through, and we only really meet her in the context of this one friendship, and there's not a lot else to colour her and her struggle. Oliver, meanwhile, has at least the relationship stuff going on, as well as ongoing uncertainty around gender identity, which is played with a lot of sincerity and vulnerability towards the end of the show, and is a terrific casual punchline for most of the thing, done in a very great way, because Oliver, for much of the show, uses he/they pronouns, so every time this comes up in conversation and Nancy refers to Oliver in the third person, she playfully checks in and says he or they, and Oliver will do something to indicate a very artificial test to be like, oh, like checking breath and then saying it's he, or like taking a pulse and going they. These moments were so funny in the workshop. They are rushed in this one. There's a moment where Noah comes in as Artie and like does a brief little CPR moment, and then they come to the conclusion that they is the pronoun, but it's rushed. It is far too rushed. Speaking of Noah Thomas, he provides drive-by brilliance as their friend. He has this great moment in the first act with See You Never. He has this great moment in the second, and this sarcastic delivery that he arrives with is so perfectly pitched. He gets these fantastic laughs that he lands brilliantly. He has these fun moments where he looks out into the audience and then quietly mouths thank you. It's a little bit of a diva performance. It's just sassy enough. He's fantastic. And this is such a dynamic, hardworking, characterful, funny ensemble. I have to tell you every damn name in this ensemble. Here we go. Jemima Brown, Josh Butler, Natasha Lever, Ran Marner, Jamel Matthias, Olivia O'Connor, Joshian Angelo Omania, Natasha Wilde, and Reese Wilkinson. The company is also completed by 4 further swings and 2 alternate performers. Everyone I saw on that stage this evening was just fantastic. A tribute to the talent of the young British musical theatre performer. They are hugely exciting. If for no other reason, go and see this show for this cast. And I say that, there are in fact many other reasons to go and see this show. This has felt like a very critical review because it's a show that felt so great. This is the greatest workshop I have ever seen. And I've seen some really great workshops and I was so excited for this. And, you know, just details about the marketing. As we've approached it, I've begun to feel a little bit unsettled. And unfortunately, I think a few of my fears around the show being that little bit overproduced, having maybe skipped an important formative stage of its development, have been confirmed this evening. I still had a great time. It is still exceptional material. I'm holding this to an incredibly high standard because that is the nature of this writing. I will say it again. This feels like the future of musical theatre. If you want to go and find out what I mean by that, go and see this show. And please do go and see this show because, as I said, it is hard to market something like this. And they have done the right thing, and the thing that we want to see. This is a completely original musical. This is not based on a film. This is not some kind of a commercial cash grab with like an obvious property that's definitely going to sell well. They have said when they wrote Six the Musical, they were thinking, what's going to sell well at the Edinburgh Fringe? And that is smart. But this is original and honest and revealing, and they have cast rising star talented performers who may not have name recognition. But this is another thing that we have said that we want, is we want to see talent recognized beyond stunt casting. And I see plenty of complaints about stunt casting. I see plenty of complaints about adaptation musicals. So I'm assuming everyone who is part of that discourse, you're all going to go see Why Am I So Single? Because this is exactly the kind of a show that needs your support. Please, please, please put your money where your mouth is. Go and buy a ticket to see this show this very month. It needs you, and it needs you right now. I'll be going back. I love this material. I love these songs. I love these performers. I love a lot of these creative choices. There are parts of it, like I said, like I've articulated here, that don't all work to the same goal. There is still an awful lot that is great about it. I've heard a lot of people who love this already. I bought the t-shirt. I am a fan. And what I would really hate more than anything else is for you to miss out on the opportunity to become a fan of this show. And I am not just talking to the Six fans, to the Mean Girls fans, to the Heathers fans. I am talking to sophisticated, discerning theatregoers of all ages. This is not just a show for young people. There is a lot of great musical theatre art of quality in this. Go and see this show. That is everything that I have to say to you about Why Am I So Single. As always, please comment down below with all of your thoughts and feelings. If you've seen it already prior to this opening press week, if after I post this video you go and see it, comment down below and let us know what you thought of the show and what you thought of my review as well. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this review wherever you are finding it. Make sure to follow me or subscribe where you are seeing my face. There will be many more reviews coming very soon, both in the West End and on Broadway. In the meantime, I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!